police officer, a deputy sheriff, or another type of law enforcement officer? Well, today we're going to talk about the 5 steps you need to take to make that dream a reality. Let's get started. Hello everybody and welcome to the Recruiting Hero Show. This is episode 19. My name is Colin Whittington. I am the CEO and founder of Recruiting Heroes LLC, a national employment agency dedicated to helping America's law enforcement officers and veterans find careers in the private sector and also helping young professionals get into law enforcement. So before my time in the business world, I was actually a law enforcement officer myself. Spent 8 years with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office in Virginia, and the last three and a half years I was the supervisor of the Background Investigation and Recruiting Unit. So I oversaw all of the hiring for the largest sheriff's office in Virginia. So I know a thing or two about hiring law enforcement officers or people trying to get into law enforcement. So if you are interested in becoming a police officer yourself, this is going to be the perfect video for you. I hope you'll quickly like this video, comment down below what agency you're hoping to go after, and then subscribe to this channel, because part of what this channel is going to be all about is helping young professionals get into law enforcement, helping law enforcement agencies recruit and retain their officers, and then finally helping law enforcement officers and veterans find amazing careers in the private sector once they're done serving. So we're going to be focusing on 3 different areas throughout all of these videos. But let's get right into it. So as I mentioned, I was a deputy sheriff and sergeant for the sheriff's office in Virginia. My last handful of years, I was doing recruiting and background investigations. So I saw a lot and I learned a lot, and I really have a phenomenal understanding of the hiring process for law enforcement. And my unit, during my time there, we actually helped get our agency down to the lowest vacancy rate in our agency's history. And this was in 2020. And as you all know, 2020 had the pandemic, it had the George Floyd incident, and so many other critical incidents that really made recruiting in law enforcement so much more challenging. So the fact that we were able to get our vacancies down that low speaks highly to the work my team and I did during that time. But now we're talking about you. If you want to get into law enforcement, the very first thing you need to do is take some time with yourself, with your friends, and with your family to consider this decision. Joining law enforcement is one of the biggest decisions you will ever make in your life. Law enforcement is a phenomenal career. I am so thankful for my nearly 8 years in the profession, but it is an identity-defining career. It's going to become a huge part of who you are. You're no longer just going to be John or Susan or whoever. You're going to be a deputy sheriff or a police officer, and that changes things. You're going to have some long hours. You're going to work late nights. You're going to work on your birthday, on your wife's birthday, on holidays. It's going to be a career that's going to take up a lot of your time and a lot of your family's, mental focus as well. When you're working midnights, your parents are going to be worried about you. Your loved ones are going to be worried about you. And you're going to have a great time, but it's going to put some stress on your family life. So just factor in everything that has to do with joining law enforcement and make sure it's the right decision for you, but also for your family. Because I really believe that to be successful in law enforcement, you need a supportive family and support system in order to be your best. And we really need the best in law enforcement. So the very first step is really consider what you want to do and make sure that it aligns with your long-term plans for you and for your family as well. Next, start doing research and trying to find the right agency. There are about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in America. So you have a massive amount of choices, and for the most part, every single one of them needs officers currently. So it's not going to be up to you to find the right agency. So do some research on what is a police department versus a sheriff's office. So I work for a sheriff's office in Virginia. As a sheriff's office, our head executive, the sheriff, is an elected position. So every 4 years, the citizens of our county would elect a new sheriff, which means every 4 years, I would potentially have a new boss. During my time, I was lucky to have the same sheriff the entire time, but that may or may not be the case for other sheriff's offices. And some people think that makes the position very political. But when you think about it, the sheriff, once he's elected, he really doesn't answer to anybody besides his citizens. The county board, the administrators, they have no authority over the sheriff. So he can really do what he or she thinks is best for that agency. Whereas in the police department, the police chief is typically appointed by politicians, by the board. So he or she does have to answer to the board, and if they don't like what he or she's doing, they can fire him. So on average, a sheriff tenure is longer than that of a police chief. So something to keep in mind. Another thing with sheriff's office, not all of them are full service. Many sheriff's offices only handle courts and corrections, which means you'd be working in the jail or in the courthouse, not on patrol. So if you're driven to be a patrol officer, make sure you either apply to a police department or a full service sheriff's office, which is what the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office where I worked was. So I was a patrol deputy at first. So factor that in. But then also think about what kind of size of agency do you want? Do you want to work for a small town with maybe 5 or 6 officers? Or do you want to work for a massive city like NYPD and have 20,000 officers working alongside you? You have to figure out what's best for you and what you really want to do long term in your career. So I encourage you to go on these agencies' websites and social media pages and do research. See what they're all about. Obviously consider the salary, that's obviously a factor, but think about what other opportunities agencies offer. If you go to a very small agency, your chances of becoming a homicide detective may be kind of slim to none, right? They may not have many openings, if any. But if you go to a bigger agency, you may have more opportunities to go into K-9, to go into SWAT, into a whole host of positions. So think long term as well, beyond your years of patrol. If you think you have aspirations for other things, consider those as well. Next, also check into their pay structure and also their retirement system. Pensions are still a thing for most agencies. Some states are still very, very good, some less good. In Virginia where I was, the retirement system is decent. It's not the best there ever is. It's certainly gotten worse in the last 20 years or so. But other states are still very, very strong, and just start doing research to make sure you're fully aware of how long you have to be there, what age can you retire, and a number of other factors. Even though you might only be in your young 20s and retirement might seem years and years away, at least give some thought to it. It doesn't have to drive your full decision, but at least be aware of what you're joining and what opportunities you will have, both in law enforcement as well as after. Next, it's time to actually apply. So for the most part, most agencies will have an official application as well as a screening questionnaire. The screening questionnaire, at least for my agency, was about a 20-page document where you go through your entire life and talk about the things that you've done. They'll ask about drug usage, they'll ask about criminal history, they'll ask about your driving history, and a whole host of other things. The biggest tip I have, and this is something I hope you take to heart, is to be 100% honest. You'll be amazed at how many things you can potentially put down as having done in your life that agencies will be completely okay with as long as you're honest. To an extent, of course. But let's say 10 years ago, you smoked marijuana when it wasn't legal in your state. Instead of lying about it, be open about it. For the most part, almost every agency nowadays is very understanding that no candidate is perfect. So if you have something in your past that you need to be honest about, make sure you are honest, because they will much rather you hear it from you than find out about it during your investigation. In my position, when I was a supervisor of our employment services section, when we were doing background investigations, if we found out that a candidate lied on his or her paperwork, it was an automatic disqualifier. And I have to tell you, a vast majority of the candidates that we disqualified for lying lied about something that, if they had told the truth about, would not have been any issue at all. So be 100% honest and thorough when you're completing that paperwork. If you're not sure, you can put a comment about that as well, but be as honest and thorough as you possibly can. Don't get caught up in a lie. So once you submit your application, typically you'll hear back from the agency within a week to a month or so. Some take longer, unfortunately, but within a month is typical. And every agency has their own background investigation and hiring processes, but typically you'll be invited in to some kind of group assessment. So these are probably going to be some kind of physical fitness tests. And again, every agency is different. For my agency, we had our candidates do the maximum amount of push-ups they could do in 2 minutes, the maximum amount of sit-ups they could do in 2 minutes. There was a step-up test where they had to step up and off of a bench for 2 minutes, and then we checked their heart rate. There was a vertical jump where they had to show how high they could jump, and then there was a 1.5-mile run. So we documented all those scores. In our agency, we never really had set numbers that our candidates had to reach. It wasn't like you have to have 10 push-ups. It was more the totality of the whole package of the candidate, what they bring to the table, as well as what they did on the physical fitness test. Some agencies do have set standards, so make sure during your research, as I mentioned in step 2, make that part of your research as well. Look into what is required. If you see that this agency requires that you can do 10 push-ups, probably no point in applying until you know for sure that you can do 10 push-ups. Because if you get to 8 and you can't make it past that, chances are you'll just be disqualified and you would have wasted your time. So do research on that as well. But for the most part, it's just a small factor. You don't have to be some kind of Navy SEAL stud to make it through the physical fitness portion. It's just a thing that they have to do as a check mark. A lot of agencies, mine especially, had panel interviews. 3 or 4 deputies that weren't involved in the hiring process at all would interview the candidates and ask questions such as, why do you want to be a deputy sheriff? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Have answers to those types of questions. One question we asked was about how you felt about using deadly force, if necessary. Would you be able to do it? You'd be pretty amazed. A lot of candidates would tell us, I could never do it, no matter the circumstance. Unfortunately, that would probably be a disqualifying factor, because there may come a time in law enforcement where you are forced to use deadly force. So you have to be willing and accepting that that could be a reality in your life. It's not something you would ever think would happen. I worked in Loudoun County, which is one of the wealthiest and safest counties in the country. And during my time, there were 2 officer-involved shootings where the officer did kill 2 people. They were both justified, of course, but it is something that could happen even in the safest of counties, so be prepared for that. Once you make it through those 2 steps, typically you are then assigned to a background investigator, and that investigator will be your point of contact with that organization and will schedule you for the rest of your assessments. So these are things like a polygraph, all right? Everyone freaks out about a polygraph. Trust me, it's not that bad. It's a little creepy. A lot of it is an interview with the polygrapher, where you're sitting there with not even hooked up to the machine. You're sitting there talking to him or her, and you're going through your packet that you've submitted when you first applied. And he'll ask any follow-up questions, and then later on he'll actually hook you up to the machine and put you through the actual test, asking about any kind of deceit or any kind of thing you may have lied about. Be as honest as you can again. The polygraph exam is not nearly as terrible as you would think. Yes, it does take 2 or 3 hours, but honestly, the majority of that time is spent having a normal conversation with the examiner. The actual test part of it is maybe like 15-20 minutes, so don't freak out about it. But again, every agency is a little different, so your experience might be slightly different from how we did things. You'll then have an interview with your background investigator, where he or she will go through your whole background history and ask you a bunch of questions. Ask you what you know about the agency, ask you about any kind of things in your past, and a handful of other things. And those interviews usually take about 2 hours or so. Once that is done, you'll be scheduled for your medical exam, where they make sure that you're medically fit to be a deputy or an officer. You'll be scheduled for a psychological exam. The psychological exam was an experience for me, for sure. For us, it took about 4 or 5 hours. You had to finish a 500 question questionnaire, asking every single question under the sun. And then you actually have a sit down with a psychologist, and he'll ask you questions as well. And that's to determine whether or not you're mentally fit to be a deputy sheriff or police officer. Not the funnest experience, but it's not that terrible either. You'll get through it. And once you've done all those things, in the background investigator will be doing his or her own investigations. They'll be talking to your neighbors, your references. They'll actually ask your references for references to try to find people that you haven't actually provided yourself. So they'll ask your references, who else can talk about Tim? And then they'll ask that person about you as well. Those are what we call developed references, and those are usually the ones that end up giving us more information than the references you provide. They'll go to former bosses, former supervisors, former coworkers, and ask them questions. They'll go to your university and get your transcripts and a number of other things. So it's a pretty lengthy process. And on average, it takes about 4 to 5 months or so, again, give or take, depending on the agency you apply to. So it is going to be a long experience, so you have to make sure you're ready for that. Don't think you're going to apply on a Monday and by Friday be a deputy sheriff or a police officer. Very unlikely. But if you make it through the whole process, which is very exciting, and it's time to actually get hired, and that's such an amazing experience. I remember I was hired, I was offered the position, and it was such an incredible feeling. I had an interview with the sheriff, and that was a really cool experience as well, and then it was told that I was given the position. And I'll never forget that feeling. Our start day I started in early June 2015, and my wife always laughs at me because the day I was actually sworn in was National Donut Day. And my wife just thought it was so funny that I became a police officer or deputy sheriff on National Donut Day, which of course is the going joke that cops love donuts. But in reality, don't we all love donuts? So give cops a break. But now that you've gotten actually hired, this is when the fun begins. Now you go through the academy. Now you go through FTO. Now you go through handling the first call for service all by yourself. The next handful of months or a year or so is going to be a whirlwind, and it's going to be a lot of fun. But we'll talk about those things on a future video. If there are things you have questions about becoming a police officer, deputy sheriff, or other kind of law enforcement officer, comment below, let me know. Do also like this video and subscribe to this channel. Again, we're going to be talking about a variety of topics. Some of it has to do with getting into law enforcement. Some of it has to do with keeping recruitment and retention strong for law enforcement agencies. And then a lot of it has to do with the actual transition from law enforcement to the private sector. So trying to cover a lot of things that might benefit you in your career, whether you're just starting law enforcement, in the middle of it, or ending your career in law enforcement. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you on the next video, guys. Bye.